And my name is Kevin O'Sullivan. I'm Environment and Science Editor with the Irish Times. IWEA Chief Executive David Connolly is going to give a quick overview first, and then we're going to move to a question and answer session. And we would be delighted to have questions from the audience. Over to you, David.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Kevin. So I'm just going to share a few slides to talk me through the first 10 minutes or so to just give people a bit of a flavor for some of the work we did in the whole 7% reduction per year space. So I suppose just as an introduction, of course, most people in Ireland know me as the CEO of the Irish Wind Energy Association. But before I joined IWEA, I used to work in Aalborg University in Copenhagen, where my time in the university was mostly focused on developing energy plans, low carbon energy plans for different EU projects. So this is a real chance to go back to my roots, you could say, and start talking not just about electricity, as I spend most of my time on day to day, but some of the stuff I used to do some research on in the heat and transport sectors also. I think just to give a bit of background, obviously many people have been focusing the government formation over the last number of months, and the 7% number became a key part of that when the Greens said it was a key issue for them. And some of the material in the next 2 or 3 slides, it kind of dawned on me when the whole discussion was happening that a lot of people were talking about what could or couldn't be done, but the key thing that was missing was numbers. So what I decided to do just one evening after work when I had a few hours spare was to start looking at, well, what do the numbers look like? What does it look like when you actually say, well, what does 7% mean, and how could we actually make up a 7% carbon reduction per year? So that the first thing when I sat down to put numbers on it was, well, what does the target look like according to the maths? So I suppose just a caveat, I'm only talking about the energy sector here. So I'm not talking about the agricultural sector, which I'll show you on the next slide is about another 20 million tons. And that's just because my background is primarily on energy modeling rather than agricultural emissions. So when I looked at the 7% reduction, it's a very simple table. It just looks at what, if you start with 40 million tons today, which is what approximately what the energy sector produces, well then year on year, if you want to achieve a 7% reduction, what do you actually get to in 2030? And that resulted in a number of around 19 million tons. So that set the benchmark. If we wanted to achieve a 7% CO2 reduction per year, we needed to get from about 40 million tons today to about half that over the next 10 years. What I turned to then was, so back in my days in Aalborg University, I used to spend a lot of time in energy models, very complicated computer simulations that would model heat, electricity and transport on an hour by hour basis over a full year. And at a high level, I'd say the model I use most might have 3,000-4,000 inputs, and it's very complicated. But what I've tried to do is remove a lot of the complexity to try and help with communication and try and explain at a high level what exactly is the carbon emissions structure of the energy sector. So it's not 100% accurate, but it gives a good flavor of where the emissions in Ireland's energy system are. And for me, this is a great tool to just kind of brainstorm through, well, if we do need to have our emissions over the next 10 years, well, what are the areas we should be putting most of our attention on? And so what this graph does effectively is break down, so the total emissions in Ireland's energy system of 40 million tons into the 3 core sectors. So transport, heat, and electricity. And these boxes are not proportionate. As you can see, my PowerPoint skills are somewhat limited. So I've only used the text to try and give a flavor of the numbers. And for me, this is critical because I suppose the way I look at climate action is the only currency that matters is carbon emissions. Like ultimately renewable energy targets, energy efficiency targets, they're all great for communication. They're great for kind of explaining to people what they need to achieve. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the only thing that matters in terms of climate action is saving emissions and reducing our emissions profile. That's what ultimately the planet will need us to do. So I've tried to construct the energy sector based on the true currency that I believe matters, which is the how much emissions we produce each year. And what you can see when you put it into that format is transport is about 15 million tons, heat is about 12 million tons, and electricity is about 12 million tons. Now, I should just caveat that this number for electricity is from 2017, so it's a little bit outdated because wind energy has grown so rapidly over the last year or two that that's probably closer to 10.5 million tons now, because we saved an awful lot of carbon emissions in 2018 and last year, with wind energy replacing money point primarily in the form of coal. And so the other thing I just caveat about this diagram is I've tried to structure it somewhat in line with what I think the solutions are for the sector. So like quite often, for example, when you look at the heat sector, people will often give emissions in terms of how much does gas use or how much does oil boilers use. What I've tried to do is divide it more into how you would relate it to the solution. And what I mean by that is, so if we just take the heat sector in the middle, I've broken it down between industry and buildings. And the reason I've done that is industry typically requires a higher temperature level than buildings for its heat demand. So they're two uniquely different solutions that we need. We need a higher temperature heat for industry than we do for buildings. So whatever solution we find for those sectors is likely to be very different. And then within buildings, I've broke that down again between urban and rural, because whatever solution we find for urban areas is likely to be a network, whereas whatever we find for rural areas is likely to be some form of individual heating. And so that's how I've structured this diagram. So starting with the overall sector, then trying to subgroup it into what I think the solutions are. And then at the very bottom, giving a flavor of what I think are the primary solutions. So not the full, there's always going to be some small parts that are made up of different things, but it gives a flavor of what I think is the key solution in that area. So if I was just to continue on the heat sector, since that's the one I started on, for rural buildings where there's some space around the building and you need an individual solution, I think the vast majority of our actions on climate change there will be by individual heat pumps. I think in some places you might need some biomass boilers just for some individual buildings that can't facilitate an individual heat pump, but I think the vast majority will be individual heat pumps. I think in urban areas, I think the main solution there is district heating. I think that's a proven technology that can deliver zero carbon heat. But again, I'm sure between these rural and urban boundaries, there may still maintain some natural gas. And then for the industry side, because you need that higher temperature, you can't use heat pumps as much as you can in the buildings. So what I expect from the research we used to do in Albury University, we used to look at bioenergy playing a much bigger role to get those higher temperatures, electric boilers that can typically deliver higher temperatures, and maybe heat pumps supplementing those at the lower temperatures. So that's kind of my kind of breakdown of the main solutions that I can see happening in the heat sector. Then on the transport side, again, I've tried to break it down into, I think, different characteristics that I think will be connected to the solutions that are needed. So private cars, I think, will be mainly electric vehicles supplemented with a move to much more public transport, cycling and walking. But I think ultimately the car is going to be a major contributor to emissions still. So I think trying to change that from petrol and diesel to electric will be a key role in that. On the other parts of the transport sector, the key problem is the energy density of batteries isn't sufficient to provide the long distance transport that we need in the other areas, like heavy duty transport with trucks, airplanes that need very energy dense fuel to travel long distances. And then there's a number of other categories, and I might come back to that during the Q&A, exactly what that other is. But because you need those energy dense fuels, that's where I expect direct electrification will be very challenging. So the proposals that we used to find were the most promising were some biofuel blends, but I think they'll be a relatively small percentage in the long run. And I think the main heavy lifting will be delivered by either hydrogen directly or hydrogen as a synthetic fuel. And again, happy to go into maybe what a synthetic fuel is in a bit more detail in the Q&A. But one outside bet that I keep an eye on all the time is something that's being developed in Sweden right now, which I think is always a good place to keep an eye on. And it's something that does allow direct electricity to be delivered to heavy duty transport, which is electric roads. So for any of you who haven't come across it, the people in the office will know it's a bit of a personal passion of mine to see how that's developing. So that's my kind of view of the transport sector. And then on the electricity sector, I think it's all about just increasing. We have such a fantastic wind resource, both on and offshore wind, that can be very much supplemented by some solar as well. And I think trying to make absolute maximum use of that renewable electricity, I think is the key way to go. So then when it came to putting together a picture of how we deliver 7%, for me, it was about looking at, well, how much of each of these solutions should we use in the next 10 years? And that's where I came up with this high level roadmap where I looked at, right, if these are the things that I think are needed in the long run, it was more or less putting what could be achieved by 2030. looking at all sorts of things like, well, how well established is that sector? What has been done in other countries? What could be done in 10 years, again, if we treated climate action like the emergency that it is. And then this table lists from, let's say, the most carbon emissions at the top, which is the huge increase in renewable electricity from 40 to 80%, down to various measures throughout the heating sector, which are the ones in orange, and the transport sector, which are the ones in grey. I think there's no perfect solution. I certainly wouldn't claim that this is absolutely the ideal way to go. I think it is a scenario as to what a 7% carbon reduction per year could look like over the next 10 years. I think maybe in the Q&A, this is where we might go back and forth on why I picked certain things or why these were my preference. And I think there's nothing to say that there isn't another scenario that could even be better than this one, but it's at least one that shows us how we get to. And just a final comment on it, I'd say my key objective here again was to simply put numbers on these things, to try and start adding numbers to give some sense of what we can achieve by quantifying the impact of some of these measures. So then the final thing I'll just talk a bit about is like is something we've been working on in IWEA, because as you can see, 70% is the current target for renewable electricity by 2030. We very much see on and offshore wind playing a huge role in that over the next 10 years. And since that 70% target was announced about a year ago, we've spent the last 12 months or so in IWEA trying to map out literally step by step what will need to happen to deliver that 70% renewable electricity target over the next decade. So I just wanted to give a final flag that over the next few weeks, you may expect to see 4 different reports starting to emerge, at least 3 of those in the next month, that will really map out how we deliver that renewable electricity contribution, which, as you could see from my CO2 map, we believe is going to make a significant contribution to Ireland's climate action over the next decade. So look, it was very high level. I hope it gives people a flavour of how I constructed it, what the purpose of it was, and put some numbers on a conversation, which I think can really bring a lot of order to the climate action discussion. So look, Kevin, I'll leave it over to you to maybe direct us on, where to take the conversation next. But I hope it gives people a flavour of what was going on in my mind when I made that initial proposal.
Great, David. Thank you very much for that. Firstly, I have to say that carbon dioxide map really captured the imagination when you tweeted it a few weeks ago, and I could see people became suddenly really engaged by it, and I think that was a very useful addition to the discussion. And I know at that stage there was a lot of speculation that 7% just wasn't realizable, and I think it changed the tone of the conversation at a whole series of levels, not just within the energy sector, but beyond that. And I thought that was a very interesting catalyst for really meaningful conversation. But could I ask you, given our record in terms of decarbonisation, and you've underlined that carbon emissions are what matter, do you think that there's a terrible risk that we'll just have this strong ambition and then we just won't deliver, as we have failed in the past on all these fronts?
Yeah, so I think there's definitely a risk, but so I suppose I kind of look at it in, if you take the renewable electricity story in Ireland, you get huge optimism. If you take the renewable heat story in Ireland, you don't feel very optimistic. I think they've been on 2 very contrasting tracks over the last decade. So like if you went back to 2006, 2007, 2008, Ireland set that ambition to be 40% renewable electricity by 2020. At the time, that was considered an absolutely enormous challenge to try and deliver that. And we look this year like we'll be very much on track. Whereas on the heating side, like, actually, sorry, just to say one last thing, that'll put us probably as a world leader in terms of integrating variable renewable electricity, like absolutely top table in the world, recognized as setting the example for everyone else. If you then look at the renewable heat sector, we set a target of 12% renewable heat. Now, to put that in context, Sweden has 65% renewable heat. So 12% renewable heat is not anywhere close to, trailblazing or setting a leadership standard. And so how is it that we've done so well on the renewable electricity side and really struggled on the renewable heat side? And if I look to what I thought was a success in Denmark, what I thought was a success in Sweden, what I thought was a success here in terms of renewable electricity, what I think is the one standout for me is back 12, 14 years ago, we made a plan as to what we actually needed to do that was very detailed in the form of the All Island Grid Study for the renewable electricity sector. That kind of focused everyone on what do we actually need to deliver? What has to happen year by year? What are the different pieces of the jigsaw? I don't think we ever made that cohesive plan for the heat sector. And as a result, I don't think it ever mobilized significant action. So if I was to say, yes, there's a risk, but I think one way we could definitely reduce that risk significantly is trying to put numbers on what do we actually need to do, and then trying to monitor, are we actually doing them, so that we're aware that we're failing in 2021 and 2022 and not aware that we're failing in 2029 or 2030.
So just to ask you a very political question, from what you're viewing in terms of the discussions on program from government, are they addressing those issues? Are you hearing the right signals in terms of what might emerge in terms of a possible agreement?
Like for me, compared to like when I think about when I came into this sector maybe 15 years ago or 13 years ago, like where the government formation is at is feels like dreamland. Like if you told me that a critical part of government formation would be how we achieve a 7% carbon reduction per year, I could have I said I would have never imagined it happening. But what I think will be critical is whatever comes out of the program for government, one of the first things the new government will have to do is sign off on our national energy and climate plan that has to go back to the European Commission, that sets out what we're actually going to do over the next 10 years. That'll have interim targets in 2022, 2025, and 2027. And I think that puts in place the, let's say, the reporting mechanism that'll mean we're going to have to demonstrate that we're on track. So I think that's going to be vital in terms of turning what is going to be very high ambition into practical steps that we have to be accountable to.
Very good. And just at this stage, if I could remind our audience that they can submit questions and just in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So we're delighted to see that already questions are beginning to roll in, and Justin Moran is helping to facilitate those. But the first question that we've got is in relation to population growth. Given that it's likely that our population is going to increase by up to 1 million, in other words, 25%. Have you factored that into your figures?
Yeah, so I suppose in ways, yes, but in different ways. So if I was just to go back very briefly to the, let's say that CO2 map, I've kind of done it in different ways in different parts of the sector. So for the electricity sector, yes, the electricity sector's future growth is all linked to EirGrid's forecast for the next 10 years. So that's a very, let's say, detailed way to account for what will happen over the next decade. For heat and transport, I've kind of been a lot more finger in the air, to be frank. So what I've done here is I've taken what the emissions, let's say, are currently right now, and I haven't put in any savings for energy efficiency improvements, and I haven't put in any additional demand for future growth. So I'm making the very ballpark assumption that the future growth that will come with that growth in people will be offset by energy efficiency that we can implement in those sectors in parallel. So again, it's a bit of a proxy and could certainly probably be broken down a bit more. So it's a bit, I'd say electricity, it's very detailed and very well taken into account. On the heat and transport side, it's very much a proxy. But the one thing I would say is, even if we do grow more, I think it will only mean we need more of these solutions that are on the bottom. I don't think it will change that we still need those solutions. So I think that might just change the actual levels rather than what they are.
I see what you mean. But just in terms of sector then, a quick overview, the heavy lifting has to be done across every sector. Is that your view, or is there ones that really stick out that have to step up to the plate in a much more significant way?
I think absolutely. I think the two that, like, every sector will absolutely have to play its part. I think the risk associated with different sectors in an Irish context is probably very different, and maybe very different to what people in Ireland might think it is. So if I was to give, like, I think for renewable electricity in Ireland, it's a very, very well brainstormed, spoken about sector. We have an awful lot of people with very, very good ideas feeding into what needs to be delivered in the renewable electricity sector. So I think that's going to play a vital role. You'll see from my emissions map that, you know, there's a huge, let's say, opportunity there to significantly reduce our carbon emissions. I think the space that I think one of the low hanging fruits is that heat sector. I think maybe just to go back, if I was to just share another graph, I just brought some supplementary graphs that I think might help inform. If I go to, let's say, this is a chart that shows the renewable heat share in every country in Europe. And as you can see, we're second last at the moment. So, like, if we were to just able copy even what the EU is doing on average in terms of renewable heat, that'll be going from like 6-7% up to over 20% or almost 20% over the next while. So I think the heat sector has a huge opportunity to just copy and paste what other countries have done. Whereas in the electricity sector, we're very much going to be leading the way. And unfortunately for the transport sector, I don't think anyone has fully figured that out. So I think that's going to be something every member state is going to have as a challenge going forward. But I really think the heat sector is a place where we could really gain a lot of traction in 10 years by using proven solutions.
So in relation to that, we have a question from Michael. Have you considered green hydrogen for industrial heat?
Yeah, so actually one thing I might just show around the whole hydrogen picture is I think energy dense fuel is going to be critical. And I think one way to get energy dense fuel is to use renewable electricity, which we have loads of in the form of wind energy, produce hydrogen and use that directly. Another thing that comes up a lot, or that we discussed a lot back when I used to be in this space on the research side, were electrofuels. And that's also using hydrogen, but using hydrogen as a fuel that's very similar to, let's say, the fuels that we use today. So on the top right, for example, you might hear this phrase for oil and gas. You often hear them being referred to as hydrocarbons. And the reason they're referred to as hydrocarbons is they're effectively a combination of hydrogen and carbon put together. So one thing you could do to get clean fuel that could directly replace what's there today is you could produce hydrogen, combine it with some carbon, and then start to produce synthetic, or what we used to call electrofuels, because ultimately this hydrogen would ideally come from renewable electricity like wind or solar. So I think absolutely hydrogen directly or this synthetic version of hydrogen, I think, could both play a vital role. The only thing I would caution is that, like what we used to be told by the people who work in the electrolyzer space, was that it's probably towards the latter stages of the decade at best before that technology is scalable at a cost-effective way. So it's probably on the best case 2030, but more likely post 2030 as a solution from what we used to always hear when we were briefed on it anyway.
Related to that, we have a question from Connor on sector coupling. Where does green or blue hydrogen production develop in Ireland?
Yeah, so sector coupling, I might just start actually by talking about sector coupling at a high level. Again, I might just go back to something I used to always use when I was in the university. So this is a chart of what I think the future electricity or future energy system looks like. So this is where, like, the vast majority of our energy will come from wind, I believe, and I think solar will be supplementary, but electricity and renewable electricity, I think, will be the foundations of our energy system in the future. And I think if you were to map this picture today, you wouldn't see lines going top and bottom. You just see lines going from left to right. You just see things producing electricity and providing electricity, things producing heat and supplying heat, things producing, let's say, fuel for transport and supplying transport. In this future sector coupled energy system, these lines that connect the electricity sector and the heat sector across other sectors, I think, is going to be the foundation of how our energy system will work. Because what happens when you do sector coupling is you connect variable renewable electricity to very, very low cost forms of energy storage. So just to give you an example, like if you connect wind energy to the heat sector via a heat pump, then when it's windy, you can turn on your heat pump and store the heat as thermal storage. Or if you take, as the question was asked about gas, if you start to produce green hydrogen, you can use your wind energy to produce electricity through an electrolyzer that can then be stored as fuel storage, either as direct hydrogen or as this synthetic fuel, which could be like a synthetic oil or a synthetic gas. And why that's so important is if I go to one slide extra I brought, the price of energy storage when you store in the form of heat or fuel is a fraction of what the price of energy storage is if you store in the form of electricity. So if we can sector couple electricity to heat and transport, we can basically connect our wind energy resource to very cheap forms of energy storage. And that's where, let's say, all hell breaks loose, in a certain, to excuse the pun, where you just the variability problem becomes in many ways solved. So I don't see a huge role for blue hydrogen myself. I think it has to be green. I think it has to be using our offshore wind resources, which offshore in particular has vast magnitudes more than what we need. I think green hydrogen should be the key focus of how we make up this sector coupling story in the years to come.
That's really fascinating, I must say. Related to the whole heating question, and I'd like to move on to wind now in a minute, but Just on the whole issue of district heating, I know it's a pet subject of yours. You've done ongoing research over the
Yeah.
years. When are we going to have a situation where district heating is like deployed in an Irish city like it is in a continental city? Is that realizable in the next decade?
Is absolutely. So I think the two conversations you need to have separately there is what can we do and what are we actually able to do. So like and I mean, I think there's a conversation about what's technically possible, and there's a conversation about what are we as a group, as a society, capable of organizing ourselves and delivering. So actually one chart that I think people might find very interesting, because if I went back to this table, let's say that I presented earlier about what we need to do, when I show this chart to people and it says 600,000 heat pumps and 10% district heating in the next 10 years, most people would absolutely think I'm mad if I think 10% district heating could be done in 10 years, but they actually will have a fairly rational conversation with you at how you might actually deliver 600,000 heat pumps. And what I always find really confusing with that is when you look at the statistics that I would have been working on in my previous job, like when you look at what other countries have done, like Sweden, back in 1970, Sweden did a 10% district heating uplift in less than a decade. Like, so that was done 50 years ago by a country that's 2 hours away on a plane. You can literally fly there and they will show you exactly how you do 10% district heating in 10 years. And not only did they do it in 1970 to 1980, they did it again from 1980 to 1985, again in 1985 to 1990. You can literally buy that solution off the shelf right now. Now that, and when we were like, Donna Gartland is doing a great work in Codema and also in the Irish District Energy Association. If you look at what is technically possible in Ireland, we absolutely have the heat demand in our cities, especially Dublin, to replicate this type of thing. But I think what we don't have, and I might give you a flavor of the numbers, is I think we struggle to organize ourselves to spend money at scale as a large group. And I've tried again, because I believe in numbers, I've tried to just show people what I mean in the numbers there, because when people talk about district heating, the first question I always get asked is, but the pipes are going to cost a fortune to install. Now, if you took 100,000 homes in Dublin, I estimate based on the prices that they pay for district heating pipes in Denmark and Sweden, you're probably looking at about 100 million euro to build the pipes for 100,000 houses in Dublin. But if you were to put a gas boiler in each of those homes, you'd be looking at least about 3,000 euro for each boiler. That's 300 million that 100,000 homes would spend on putting in their gas boilers. So like, in other words, the money we spend putting in individual gas boilers would be 3 times more than what it would take to build the pipes for a district heating system. But the problem I often find is people can individually put in a gas boiler, and that's very easy to do as an action, where spending 100 million on pipes around the city requires a real coordinated approach across a lot of stakeholders. So I know that's a long way to answer your question, Kevin, but I think technically there's absolutely no reason we couldn't deliver 10% district heating in 10 years. But as a society, can we organize ourselves well enough to be able to manage a 100 million euro project that is delivered successfully in 10 years? I think that's a much more tricky question. And just one last thing I'll say before we move off on it, because this drives me absolutely mad. In a world where we're talking about climate change being an emergency and a national emergency, there is currently more heat being thrown away in Dublin than we would need to heat the entire city. And I just think people really need to hear that again. Like, we are literally throwing away more heat for free right now than we would need to replace all the gas that's used to heat Dublin City. And district heating pipes would mean that instead of throwing that away, we actually use it. And in a world where climate change is an emergency and where this solution has been proven for 50 years, that just seems like a no-brainer if we can just organize ourselves well enough to deliver it.
I agree entirely. I think political awareness is also necessary, and those figures are very persuasive, but there seems to be a sort of a gap there in terms of action, but hopefully it'll be addressed in the short term. So as I said, we're going to move over to the wind issue now. And can you give us your view initially of the announcement last week of government approval for 7 projects to accelerate them in effect, and to flag that the appropriate marine development legislation is likely to come in the early weeks or months of the next government?
Yeah, so look, I think it's a great news. It's a fantastic step forward. It's really great news for our membership and the guys in the offshore side of the house. I think just the first thing I'd say about renewable electricity, I just want to make that point again. We are world leaders at the renewable electricity problem. And I think it's really important that we remind ourselves of that, because, there's an awful lot of talk about what we can't do. We just need to remind ourselves that when we decide to do something, and when we decided to deliver that 40% renewable electricity target, we delivered a world leading solution. I think it's just really important to remember that. So I think our renewable electricity ecosystem, our renewable electricity industry is really delivering world leading solutions. And right now, like, people mightn't have, just in case you didn't see it, Q1 of 2020 was the first time ever that wind energy produced more electricity in Ireland than any other form of fuel. Like, that is a phenomenal achievement, to have a full quarter where wind energy is producing more electricity than anything else. We hope to be at the 40% renewable electricity target by the end of this year. We need to get it to at least 70%. Maybe after government negotiations, that'll be at 80%. But I think what can be often missing in that number is that it might sound like we're doubling our renewable electricity, but we're actually doing much more than that, because demand is growing so rapidly over the next 10 years. So we think we're at about 4,000 megawatts. Well, we know we're at about 4,100 megawatts of onshore wind right now. The Climate Action Plan is looking to deliver about 8,000 megawatts of onshore wind, at least 3,500 megawatts of offshore wind, and about 1,500 megawatts of solar. Like, that is a doubling of our onshore, a rapid growth of our offshore sector, and solar coming into the mix as well. Like, I think we've proven we can deliver. I think we'd be very optimistic that we can do that. It'll take an absolute coordinated effort and a focused effort from everyone. But that announcement last week has been a huge bottleneck relieved on the offshore side. So up until last week, projects weren't able to progress to the next stages of development. After the announcement next week, they'll be able to progress with their planning and progress with their grid offer submissions. So it really helps to move them along. And in the context of 10 years, trying to develop that infrastructure, 10 years might sound like a long way away, but in the context of that infrastructure, it's a huge challenge. So it's great to see some progress in that area.
Can you give us an overview of location and types of technology that's likely to be used? Obviously, the development is going to happen in the Irish Sea primarily in the initial years, and then it's likely to spread more to the west and south. But what does that mean for the type of installation that's likely to be installed? And what's the ratio going to be in terms of fixed and floating turbines?
So yeah, sure. So on the offshore side, in the short term, I think it's certainly going to be East Coast fixed offshore wind. That's what's proven, let's say, in other parts of the continent today. So I think that's the technology we'll rely on. Pretty much almost all of the projects that were announced last week, except one, are on the East Coast. And so let's say we know that we don't know exactly which project is going to be successful first, but we know it's going to be one of them, and it's likely to be the one on the one of the ones. It'll be almost certainly one of the ones on the East Coast. So I think it's the East Coast, Irish Sea, fixed bottom offshore that we're likely to see first. I think, like, in terms of scale, like, we don't know in IWEA exactly what capacity each of those wind farms will be just yet. That's something that they're going to have to develop now as they progress through their development process. But if you were to take a typical offshore wind farm, you're probably talking of somewhere in the region of about 50 turbines off the coast, just to give it a sense of scale. Like, nowadays, offshore turbines are in the region of 12, even 15 megawatts. There was a new turbine announced only a month ago. Like, they're much bigger offshore because they're out at sea, of course. So I think that maybe in order to deliver 3,500 megawatts, it just depends on exactly what size those projects come in at, but maybe somewhere in the region of 5 to 6 of those projects will need to be a success, and others will join them as the decades passes by. So I think for me, the most important thing is that we simply get it started. I think we need to just get projects moving now, because I know there's a huge prize waiting for offshore wind, like absolutely enormous. Like, Ireland has more offshore wind than we could ever know what to do with. But I think the most urgent thing in the next 12 months is to simply make sure that we start that sector moving forward as fast as we can.
And the floating technology then, is that necessarily going to be constrained in the West Coast because of
Yeah,
the...
I'd say just because of the depth of the water, I think we're likely to see, who knows, if that technology develops rapidly, maybe by the second half of the decade, we might start to see projects around the West Coast come along. But with the more deeper waters along the West, I think offshore on the West Coast will most certainly move towards floating turbines. Look, there's a lot of exciting developments happening in that space. Like we're seeing some pilots projects have already kickstarted for a number of years and are showing very promising signs that they can operate very successfully. So like I think it'll be a really exciting development if we can, like, once the floating offshore wind sector has become a more mature technology, like Ireland's sea area is about 10 times our land area. So we really do have an enormous potential once that floating offshore wind sector is established. But I think in the early years, it's likely to be East Coast fixed bottom. Maybe towards the latter half of the decade or early into the next decade, it's around to the south and west predominantly with floating. I think that could be how that offshore story evolves in Ireland over time.
And when do you think we could become a significant exporter of renewable electricity?
I'd say it's as fast as we can manage to organize delivering that to the continent. Like, so the resource is there, but like that becomes much more, I think, can we get the agreements in place to actually agree with other countries how we deliver it? So it's as fast as as the agreement can be put in place, and that's becomes a political question rather than a technical question, because like there's no doubt that we have far more than what we need. And like don't forget as well that like there's a huge uplift in our onshore sector coming over the next decade as well. Like we're going to double the amount of capacity that's delivered on that side. So I think people in Ireland can sometimes forget. This was something that really hit me when I was working on the other energy strategies for EU countries, like the likes of your Czech Republic or your Central European countries. They don't have renewable resources the way we do. Like they struggle to find, let's say, capacity factors that are very promising for onshore wind, and naturally countries like that don't have offshore when they're landlocked. Like in Ireland, I'm not sure we fully appreciate just how fortunate we happen to be that we have an enormous abundance of both on and offshore wind still left to tap into. So the sooner we can start to either use that ourselves first on the first instance and make sure we're satisfying our own needs, but then there's absolutely no doubt there's an abundance of export opportunities down the road once we can provide it to others, because Europe will certainly need it. So Europe will be short of resources.
Before we move on, just on the issue of onshore wind and the wind energy guidelines, I know they've been very controversial in terms of certain elements of it. Can you give us a quick update on where they stand now and highlight the one big issue that you had concerns about?
Yeah, so the wind energy guidelines went for consultation towards the end of last year. Submissions closed in February. I think the vast majority of it we can live with as an industry. I think there's definitely very openness to compromise and make sure that there's a willingness on both sides there to accommodate a change into the future. Like the setback distance proposed in it is 4 times tip height. That'll result in about a 40% decrease in the land available for onshore wind. But we as an industry we can accommodate that because it still leaves enough land for us to deliver the targets for 2030 and maybe even some beyond. But the one key problem we have is that the scientific methodology around the noise proposals, not only according to us as IWEA, but even an independent group of acousticians, was deemed not unfit for purpose effectively, and full of inconsistencies and errors. And that's very difficult for us as an industry to comply with a standard that is not scientifically robust. So what we'd really like to see is that the scientific basis for that noise proposal is simply based on the best science available. We believe the Northern Irish standard is a very well proven one. So that's the one we'd like to see come in. And just one thing I might flag on the onshore side, again, that maybe people forget, because we come from this has changed rapidly over the last 10 years. Like there is no doubt that over the next decade, onshore wind in Ireland should be the cheapest form of not just renewable electricity, but electricity in Ireland. Like onshore wind in other countries in Europe is currently being delivered at 30 euros a megawatt hour. Our electricity market price over the last few years is probably around 50 euros a megawatt hour. So if Ireland can get anywhere close to what other countries are doing with less wind than we are, onshore wind should be the cheapest way to produce electricity. And I think we haven't fully kind of come to terms with that. We still think of renewables as a sacrifice or as a cost. And the 70 by 30 work, and I'll just share it very, very briefly because I know we probably want to move on. But like what we found in the 70 by 30 work was, if we could get to a average price of 60 euros a megawatt hour in Ireland for renewable electricity over the next decade, then the 70% target was cost neutral for Ireland to implement. And that study is available online, people can go into it. But if 60 euros a megawatt hour is cost neutral, we're actually cheaper to do a clean renewable electricity sector if we get anywhere close to the levels like other countries are achieving at the 30 and 40 euros a megawatt hour. And I really wish in some ways people could kind of move on from the past of, cost was always associated with climate action, and start to look at what the numbers are that others are achieving, and see this as not just an opportunity on the climate side, but actually an opportunity on the cost side to save money as well.
Just related to planning and particularly onshore, we have a question from Michael. Any comments on our planning regime in terms of a scenario where anybody can object and obstruct and delay and seek a judicial review, and what in your view needs to be done about this?
Yeah, so look, I think it's very hard to try and take away people's, let's say, right to object. I think that's fundamental to any planning system. What I think, and I think what the IWEA view, if I was to capture it very briefly, would be one place that we can absolutely improve and should improve in the very near future is just making decisions on planning applications much faster than we actually are right now. So like there's an objective in our planning authorities, in our SID process, our strategic infrastructure development process that On Board Planola run, to make decisions within around an 18-week period. Our experience has been that that's been taken over a year in historically. So rather than making decisions in a few months, it's been taken over a year. Like whether or not your project is successful or not successful, it can only help that you know the answer much faster than you're getting right now. So I think that for me is one low-hanging fruit where we could really improve our planning system, is just giving people clarity much quicker on, is this project likely to succeed or not succeed? So you can either go back to the drawing board or you can progress to the next step. I think that's, if I was to pick one thing in the near future that we could do to really speed things up, that'd be my main ask, because I think it's very difficult to get into the space of not allowing people to object. I think that's kind of fundamental to the whole planning system as a whole, and probably needs to be maintained.
We're in the fortunate position. We have lots of questions coming through, so I'll try and get through a few of them quickly.
Yeah, sure.
A number of questions come up under agriculture, and it'd be interesting to get your take on that, and in terms of what it has to contribute, how we sort of get to a sort of a unified position in addressing issues around carbon and agriculture. And also there's a lot of questions about data centers and the whole issue about their
Yeah.
power consumption, their use of renewables, etc. So if you want to give a quick overview on both of those.
Yeah, so look at on agriculture. It's not that agriculture has to play a huge role, and I hope, like, I might just bring up my my CO2 map, and I hope like my lack of detail in agriculture doesn't come across like it's not important. I think it's absolutely vital. The only problem is I'm not an expert in it, and I don't really want to get into something that I can't give a qualified opinion about. Of course, I can give an opinion because I read the headlines. I'm aware of the number of missions. I'm aware of the challenges around, dealing with reducing the herd and managing that. But I'm the only reason I'm reluctant to get into it is it's not my area of expertise. So my opinion there would be just the same as anyone else's opinion. And as I said to you, Kevin, I actually grew up on a beef farm. So my experience of the agricultural sector is more being in it rather than in analyzing its carbon emissions. So I don't know enough about what the solutions are or what contribution they could make. And I think it's vital that we unlock that. Like, I know Chagos made their own marginal abatement cost curve. I read it, I thought it was an interesting study, but I certainly wouldn't qualify myself as being able to critique it, because I read it as to educate myself rather than to be able to critique, because I just don't have the background to be able to do it. But all I would say is I think it is vital that we do find solutions there. I think the energy sector might offer some alternative incomes for farmers, like, whether it be, if a wind energy project comes close to your area, there is going to be the opportunity to buy shares in that in the next decades. Once the details have been ironed out, there is huge community benefit funds coming to rural Ireland that could really stimulate new projects. Like, the onshore wind sector will probably deliver hundreds of millions of euro in direct community benefit funds that, many people that will be neighbors to wind farms will be farmers. The land that's rented for a wind farm project is typically farmers, biogas facilities, like, and even, dare I say, even in re-educating yourself. Like, it's a funny story, actually. The Vestas, which many people will know of, is the largest turbine supplier in the world. Vestas was historically an agricultural engineering company in Denmark back in the 1960s. But when they needed to diversify their income, they decided to start building turbines. And who knows, like, the town I grew up in, there was 2 or 3 agricultural engineering companies. This energy transition, I think, could really offer new areas that they move into to try and diversify the solutions that they work in, not just in agriculture, but branching into the energy sector. On the data centers one, I struggle to understand why this gets the attention it does, to be frank, because, like, if we achieve the 70% renewable electricity target, the electricity sector will account for 4 million tons of CO2. So the entire electricity sector, if we, and I really think we can do it, will be a very, very small proportion of our overall carbon emissions once we implement that. Now, I think it's absolutely important that we talk about it, but if you were to ask me what is the most important thing to be talking about, I would be much rather talk about why are we doing so badly on renewable heat, where we could probably change the dial by 6 million tons over the next decade, rather than talking about a proportion of the electricity sector that will make up a much smaller share. So I know EirGrid's forecasts are that data centers might be 30% of our demand if they grow at the scale they will by 2030. But even if they are 30%, 30% of 4 million tons, you're talking about 1.3 million tons. It's not the number one item I'd put on my agenda if I wanted to raise concerns around carbon emissions. There's others that'd be higher up the list. So definitely worth, I think, a conversation, but it would be much lower on my priority list than many of the others that I think can change the dial much more.
We have a question from Friends of the Earth. Any comments on supporting communities to get involved? The RES auction will have the first community preference category soon, which is obviously very positive, but how is that going to be developed and take root?
Yeah, look, so I have a very funny story behind that, actually. I probably am one of the only people in Ireland that has bought a share in a wind farm, because I happen to live in Denmark, where it is. So that's a bit of a funny irony now that I happen to work in the Irish Wind Energy Association. My own personal views are that the community benefit schemes and the community investment share offering is likely to bring an enormous amount of people from communities into the transition. I really think, like in Denmark, I think it was in the scale of 30 or 40,000 people had a very, very small share in a wind farm. And, over time, maybe we can replicate that success if we can put in place a system that works for both communities and the people who are developing the projects. I think that's where you can really reach out to scale. I think in terms of individuals developing their own projects, I think there's a space for that in RAISE, but I think the volume of projects that will take up that space will probably be much less than the people that will take up the idea of buying a very small share in a project that someone else is developing. I think there's a role in it. I think the value of that is not a euro per megawatt hour value. That's about bringing people with us on the transition, because there's a huge change coming, and I think there's definitely a space for that. But I think it has to be balanced with, like, there is definitely a trade-off there on the cost side with how much volume we put in that space. So I don't know where the magic number is there. I think it's a balancing act, and I can certainly see a role in terms of helping people come with us on a transition with that. But my own personal experience has been it's much easier for large volumes of people to buy into a project through a small amount of money in a share, where they don't have to do the heavy lifting themselves, than it is to try and build a project themselves from scratch. And I think the success of what we've seen in other member states has proven that.
We have a number of questions on interconnection, and how do you view its importance in terms of expansion of the wind sector, particularly obviously in the offshore scenario?
Yeah, vital. So I think two things I'd say in terms of interconnection. I think its main function in the short term will be to just help us keep our power system reliable. So having that facility that when it's really windy, to send some of our excess wind, when it's not as windy, being able to import if we need it, that security it offers, that opportunity it offers to be able, trade with our neighbors and provide a backup plan if our power system ever needs an extra kind of valve to release some excess production or an extra source of power. In IWEA, the analysis we did in 70 by 30, suggest that interconnection is a vital part of being able to balance the system by 2030. So I think Greenlink, that's going to connect us to the UK, and the Celtic interconnector that's going to connect us to France, absolutely vital parts of we as the wind industry being able to deliver our target by 70 by 30. I think the second core function of it in the end though, which is, let's say, similar, but I think almost a separate conversation, is it provides us with a facility to export our vast resource in time to the continent. I think in that space, you might even be looking at designated cables or power lines going from Ireland's offshore and on, maybe some onshore in time, but definitely offshore resource, being able to export electricity directly onto the mainland. I think that's not so vital for us to be able to balance our power system. That's more of a pure export opportunity play. And I think that has to be on Ireland's agenda. We just seen last week that Denmark announced they're going to build 2 energy islands, which is effectively a combination of offshore wind, some onshore wind on some islands, and cables trying to directly feed into the European power system. In time, they said they may put hydrogen production facilities on those islands as well. I think Ireland should certainly put itself in that conversation as a country, as well as Denmark, that could potentially offer that to the continent down the road.
We've another question related to storage in that, and we haven't really gone into that area as well. How important is that, and how do you see that technology expanding over the next decade?
Yeah, so actually, one of my supporting slides, I should have put in a nice graphic that my colleague Noel Kniff put together in a study that IWEA did recently called Store, Respond and Save. Because I think what people may confuse, and even for myself when I was working in this back in the day, I used to often think of, storage on the electricity sector as being something that could balance excess power with times of shortage in power. Whereas I think that's probably not the key function of batteries in the next 10 years. I think the key function of batteries is likely to be providing system services rather than actually helping us balance large volumes of energy at different times of the day. And what I mean by that is, and again, it's a bit tricky to explain without maybe having a chart in front of me, but the in the past, power stations have effectively provided the technical system services we needed to keep our power system stable. When wind energy comes along and kicks the power stations off, they don't provide those very vital system services that the power stations used to provide for us. By having batteries on our electricity grid, they can do that without interfering with the amount of wind energy we have in our system. So having batteries as a on standby, ready to jump in if they need to provide some services to our grid, is the vital role that batteries will need to play over the next decade. And I think there's going to be a number of projects coming on very soon. In our 70 by 30 work, I think we estimated around 1,500 megawatts of batteries would be needed. It's a ballpark number. We don't know exactly the number, but I think that's the type of scale you'll be looking at in the Republic, and then also some in the North over the next decade to deliver that 70 by 30, and maybe even more if we go as far as 80.
Forgive me jumping topics, but we have a number of questions on EVs, and you touched on that in one of your slides. How do you view their role, given there's low uptake at the moment, but yet very ambitious targets? There's uncertainty about cost, and the fossil fuel scenario has obviously been thrown into shock by COVID and all of that. So how do you reconcile all that? And are the targets realizable?
Right. So just in terms of are the targets realizable, I absolutely accept that they're massively challenging. But again, I might just go back to numbers, where I like to go to when I need a bit of comfort in life. And I just have this slide that I just, when I was looking at through some news recently, this popped up on my newsreel. Norway currently has 75% of its vehicles being sold have plugs. So that's what Norway is achieving right now. Ireland's annual car sales are around 125,000 cars a year. If we can achieve what Norway is already achieving today on average over the next decade, that's 900,000 EVs. So if we're in a climate emergency, is it reasonable to say, can we achieve what another country has already proven can be achieved on average over the next decade? And for me, that makes me feel like what is an enormous challenge might actually be possible. I accept that Norway is a very special country in the sense that it has you know, it has a lot of funding, a lot of money because of its reserves with oil, and it has 100% renewable electricity system because of hydro even, and things like that. But I think it certainly, for me, makes what feels like a very, very ambitious target at least feel worth having a conversation to map out in detail how we might actually do it. Because I think if we're going to start by assuming we can't do something, and this is kind of back to my district heating story as well, if another country has already shown it can be done, at least we should start with, well, what are they doing and how can we achieve the same? Rather than maybe starting with, well, that's so big we couldn't possibly do it. And I think especially because there's so many things we'll have to do that somebody hasn't already shown us can be done. I think there's optimism that electric vehicles can really deliver over the next decade. Personally, I think they're vital. You know, I've already convinced my father to buy one, and he's a West of Ireland farmer from Mayo. So if I can convince him, I think I can convince anyone. So I think they're 90% efficient. You know, they get us directly a connection between our wind energy and our solar power right to the wheel of a car. I think the prices are dropping dramatically, and fundamentally, if anyone has ever driven one, they're really enjoyable to drive. I'm going through a major frustration myself right now. I live in an apartment on the edge of Dublin, and the apartment block won't let me put in a charger, and that's proven very, very frustrating because I'd like to buy an EV. I had ordered an EV, but I'm not actually able to put one in. And I think that for me is, if we can't even allow the people who are willing to spend the money and want to do it, we certainly won't have a chance. So I think we need to clear bottlenecks like that would really release a lot of things so that we don't kind of talk ourselves into something being impossible before we've even maybe had a look at what would actually be required.
Very good. And could I ask you, just, you touched on solar, but a quick overview, and we're coming to the end now, but a quick overview on how you see solar developing in Ireland over the next decade.
So I used to work with these guys from Aarhus University when I was back in when I was living in Copenhagen, and their whole research space was looking at how different renewable resources could help each other by being different. And what I mean by that is sometimes when the wind isn't blowing, the sun is shining. Sometimes when the sun isn't shining, the wind is blowing. And I think there's a value in that. So solar in Ireland is likely to be it is going to be more expensive than wind because we just don't have that competitive advantage. It won't come as a surprise to anyone. We're not a very sunny place, but there is a price premium that solar is worthwhile at because it complements wind by happening at times that wind is not occurring. And I think, I don't know what the magic number is in that. It might be something that evolves through the res auctions, but it's certainly there is certainly a mix that's needed. I think that's something we should let the res auctions maybe find. So the renewable electricity support scheme is going to be run by saying to the industry, we need X volume of renewable electricity. Who can provide that at the cheapest? And I think as we do that process, it'll start to emerge, well, there's some mix between wind and solar where the cheapest actually occurs. Off the top of my head, I think it might be something in the ballpark of, 10% solar, maybe 15% solar, 85, 90% wind as a ballpark mix. Again, just going off what the guys in Aarhus University used to do. I don't have an analysis myself on that, so I wouldn't claim that I have the magic number, but I think there's certainly a complementary factor solar can make to wind. But dare I say, not only because I work for IWEA, and I promise I would have said this even before I got the job, I think in Ireland, the major competitive advantage and the major thing we have to offer is wind. Whether it's the price that onshore can offer or it's the scale that offshore can offer, that is what we have as an advantage. That is our unique selling point. That is the advantage we have over most other countries in the world. And I think that's where, we can really deliver either value or scale, and in time, probably both.
Well, just to go back to your very first sentence about the importance of carbon emissions, and this is my last question to you, and then I'm going to ask you to show a photograph from Copenhagen to show what is possible in the new world. But what would your wish list be in terms of the new government, and what key actions in terms of achieving genuine and significant decarbonisation should they take if they come into office in the short term?
So number one would be that they make the Department of Climate Action just the Department of Climate Action, and that's all that the minister focuses on. That'd be my number one ask. Secondly, that the first thing they do is allocate the resources we actually need to deliver this to the public sector. Like, I don't, no matter how much will in the world you have, if you don't have enough people or you don't have enough resources, industry and the people that actually have to do it will just be always knocking on the door with frustration that things are not happening. Like this, if this is an emergency, let's designate the resources and the funding that's needed to actually have enough people to make the changes that we need to do. So I think one, a dedicated department to climate action. Two, this adequate resources within that department and the supporting stakeholders like the CRU, Airgrid, ESB networks on board Planola, like the planning aspects of it, having enough just public servants and civil servants and stakeholders resource sufficiently to do what they need to do. And then my third ask would be that that National Energy and Climate Plan sets the ambition of 7% per year, and we actually try to monitor it year by year and not just let it slip until latter parts of the decade. And of course, my National Energy and Climate Plan, I suppose that's my pitch for what it could be based on my knowledge today is this roadmap. That's my best attempt to try and think what would be a reasonable level of ambition in a 10-year time frame for each sector to put in front of itself as an ambition that they could actually deliver on. But checking in the year 2022 to say, are we on track? And if we are not on track, what do we need to deliver? Not in a conversation, but in numbers on a plan. Because I think when numbers are on a plan, everyone becomes much more focused and accountable to what they're actually trying to do.
Well, thank you very much for that. I think there's a lot of very useful pointers there. And thank you very much for your excursion through so many topics and for presentation of complex data in a very accessible way, which I think made it very interesting. And I think just to give people a lift in terms of what can be realizable, I think if you show them your photograph from the center of Copenhagen.
Yeah, sure, I will. Yeah, this is a photo that my wife took on the way to work one morning when we were living in Copenhagen. It's rush hour in the morning in Copenhagen. And I really enjoy showing it to friends because this is the center of Copenhagen city at rush hour, and it's one of the main busiest roads that leads right into the city. And as you can see, the bike traffic is backed up for a long way, and there's only 3 cars, and this is at a traffic lights right. Anyone who knows Copenhagen, this is on the lakes, the 4 lakes that are on the edge of Copenhagen, right in the center of Copenhagen city. But it's funny because when I talk about Copenhagen and I talk about district heating, everybody says, it's too cold in Copenhagen, that's why they have district heating. When I talk about biking, they say, sure, it's lovely weather in Copenhagen, that's why everyone bikes. So I think in Ireland, if we could maybe stop telling ourselves that it's not possible and instead maybe just look at what we could do, I think things like this could be very achievable. Like I cycle along the quays in Dublin all the time, and one thing that flashed up in my newsreel recently was, the quays is going to be getting an €800,000 fund to try and improve cycling lane infrastructure, but the IWE office is out in Naas, and Naas just got 120 million to upgrade a 2-lane motorway to a 3-lane motorway. Like, I actually felt like shouting at the radio when I heard this. I was like, how are we only getting 800,000 to get a bike lane that maybe will help save my life on the Dublin Quays, and yet we're getting 120 million just to add an extra lane to an already pretty reasonable road in the form of Naas bypass. So, like, Copenhagen, it has 40% of people cycle to work. Even the Prime Minister often cycles to work, and I think that often helps as well in terms of how infrastructure is developed. So I think Dublin would be a fantastic city if cycling infrastructure was more segregated and more easy to access. I know my wife would certainly have continued cycling if it was, and unfortunately she's stopped since we moved back because it isn't. So what can be done, I think, is often there for us to see if we just take the time to take a plane journey over to our neighbours in Europe and have a look at it.
A great illustration, I have to say, to end our discussions today. And I think COVID has given us all a very rough time in many respects, but it might even nudge us in that direction in terms of redesigning our cities for the betterment of all. So on my behalf, I'd like to thank all the audience for tuning in and for their questions. And thank you, David. And to say that the webinar will be available on YouTube. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Really appreciate you sharing it. Much appreciated. Thanks a lot. And thanks everyone for joining in.